The dust storm on Verdania had finally settled by the time the sky started to behave strangely. Children playing in the central plaza were the first to notice. The clouds above the colony were moving in the wrong direction, pulled by something that did not belong to weather. Then the light changed. A long shadow crossed the rooftops, slow and heavy, the kind of shadow that should not exist on a peaceful afternoon. The children stopped running and looked up. In her office on the 4th floor of the Colonial Administration Building, Director Anna Webb was reviewing crop yield reports when the building shook. Not a hard shake, just enough to make her coffee tremble in its mug and a pen roll off her desk. She walked to the window and saw the sky. 6 dark shapes hung above the colony, each one the size of a small mountain, each one bristling with spines and ridges that caught the sunlight in cold, sharp angles. Anna had spent 20 years on the frontier. She knew what alien warships looked like. She had just never seen one this close. Her hand was already on the emergency console before her brain caught up. Inside the largest of the 6 ships, Warlord Krass of the Drogan hegemony stood on a raised platform of polished black stone. His armor was the color of fresh blood, and the crystalline plates across his chest hummed with a soft inner light. Around him, Drogan officers worked at curved consoles, reporting in the clicking, hissing language of their species. Krass listened without expression. The human colony below was small, pathetic. 6,000 soft creatures living in flimsy buildings made of metal and glass. He had crushed worlds 100 times this size. This would not even be a battle. It would be a lesson. Sub-Commander Vroth approached and lowered his head. His armor was duller than the warlord's, scratched from decades of service. He spoke quietly. He said the scouts had detected a small flotilla of human ships hiding behind the system's outer moon. They were primitive, maybe 12 vessels in total. Vroth suggested a fast, clean strike to remove them before landing forces. Krass laughed. The sound was deep and wet, like stones being ground together underwater. He told Vroth that the humans should be allowed to see their fleet first. They should watch their last hope rise from behind the moon, fly toward the Drogan ships, and be torn apart in front of the colony. The fear, Krass said, was the point. A conquered people who had no fear were a problem. A conquered people who had watched their defenders die would never raise their heads again. Vroth said nothing. He had served Krass for 30 cycles. He had learned long ago that when the warlord spoke of fear, no one was permitted to disagree. The Drogan fleet drifted lower, slow and proud, casting its shadow over half the colony. Behind the outer moon, 300,000 kilometers away, the human Third Fleet was waking up. Commander Daniel Ross sat in the dim red light of his command deck, watching 6 new contacts bloom across his tactical display. His ship, the Hammerhead, was a long, narrow vessel painted matte black to swallow radar. She did not look like much. She did not need to. Ross had been waiting for this day for 11 years, ever since the first whisper of Drogan expansion had reached human ears. He had argued for the Railgun program when others had laughed at it. He had fought for the funding, the testing, the secret yards on the dark side of Mars. And now, finally, the universe had sent him a target. Lieutenant Sarah Bellamy was 3 meters away at the targeting station. She was 26 years old and the best gunner in the fleet. Her fingers moved across the console without hesitation, locking onto the lead Drogan cruiser, calculating drift, mass, distance, and angle. She did not look up when Ross spoke. He told her to power the rails to full charge, but hold fire. He wanted them closer. He wanted them slower. He wanted the first shot to be one no one ever forgot. Sarah nodded once and entered the command. Across the fleet, in 11 other ships, gunners did the same. The huge magnetic coils that ran the length of each vessel began to draw power. The hum was so deep that crew members felt it in their teeth before they heard it. Lights dimmed. Engineers braced. The Hammerhead became a coiled spring waiting to release. On the surface, Director Anna Webb had finished broadcasting the emergency alert. Sirens wailed across the colony. Civilians rushed toward the underground shelters that had been dug years ago and quietly forgotten. Captain Henry Wells, commander of the small ground militia, was already rolling armored vehicles into defensive positions around the spaceport. He had 200 soldiers. The Drogans, by his rough count, could land thousands. He did not look afraid. He looked focused. He had told his soldiers that morning that fear was a luxury for people who had time to feel it. In the sky above, The Drogon flagship reached its ceremonial position. Krass raised one clawed hand. The signal to begin the slow, public destruction of the human fleet was about to be given. He never lowered it. Behind the moon, Commander Ross watched the lead Drogon cruiser drift into the perfect firing solution. He took a slow breath. He thought of the 11 years, the doubters, the dead engineer who had first sketched the coil design on a napkin in a Mars cafe. He let the breath out. He told Sarah to fire. She did. The slug left the hammerhead in complete silence. There was no flash, no roar, no streak of light across the void. Space did not allow such drama. A finger of tungsten the size of a fence post simply vanished from the rails and reappeared, 60 kilometers per second later, on a path that nothing in the universe was going to stop. The crew of the hammerhead felt the recoil through their boots, a long shudder that traveled the length of the ship like a deep cough. Then the lights came back to normal, and Sarah Bellamy began calculating the next shot. 3 seconds. That was how long the slug took to cross the gap between the moon and the lead Drogon cruiser. 3 seconds in which Krass still had his hand raised. 3 seconds in which Sub-Commander Vroth was turning to relay the order to the gunnery decks. 3 seconds in which the cruiser's captain, a young officer named Threll, was thinking about a meal he had been promised when the colony was conquered. Then the slug arrived. The crystalline armor of the Drogon cruiser had been forged on the Drogon homeworld in vast pressure forges that took 200 cycles to grow a single plate. It was the pride of the hegemony. It had stopped plasma cannons, antimatter torpedoes, and beam weapons of a dozen conquered species. It had never met a piece of metal moving at 20% the speed of a beam itself. The slug did not pierce the armor. It did not punch through it. It simply ignored it. The crystalline plates exploded outward in a cloud of glittering powder, like sugar struck by a hammer. The slug continued through the ship, through the crew decks, through the engineering core, and out the other side, leaving a tunnel of ruined air behind it. The cruiser cracked along its spine. Atmosphere blew out in twin jets that spun the wreck slowly end over end. Threll never finished his thought about the meal. On the Drogon flagship, every console screamed at once. Krass lowered his hand. He stared at the tactical display, where the lead cruiser had become a slow cloud of debris and dust. His mouth was open. He did not know it was open. Vroth looked at him, then back at the display, then at the empty space where a warship had been 1 moment earlier. The room went silent. Even the consoles seemed to hush, as if the ship itself was trying to understand what had just happened. Vroth was the first to recover. He shouted at the sensor officer to identify the weapon. The officer, a thin Drogon named Keswick, stuttered that there had been no energy signature. No heat bloom. No charge buildup. The cruiser had simply broken apart. Keswick suggested it might have been an internal failure. Krass turned slowly. His eyes found Keswick. He told the officer that internal failures did not occur during combat operations. He told Keswick that Drogon ships did not break. He told Keswick to find the weapon. A second slug arrived during the sentence. The cruiser to the left of the flagship folded inward, as if something had reached through it and pulled. The bridge module sheared off and tumbled into the upper atmosphere, trailing fire and frozen bodies. A third slug followed 2 seconds later. Another cruiser died. On the hammerhead, Sarah Bellamy worked without speaking. Her targeting display showed her the heat shadows of the Drogon ships, the faint magnetic signatures of their reactors, the precise angle of their drift. She was not aiming with her eyes. She was aiming with mathematics, and mathematics did not miss. Around her, the other gunners of the Third Fleet were doing the same. 11 ships. 11 railguns. A volley every 4 seconds. Commander Ross watched the kill counter climb on his tactical board. He felt nothing. He had decided long ago that he would feel things later, after the work was done. Right now, the work was the only thing in the universe. He told Sarah to bring the fleet out from behind the moon. There was no longer any reason to hide. The Hammerhead and her sister ships rose above the lunar horizon, 12 dark shapes drifting into open space. To the Drogons, they appeared on tactical screens as small, slow, and lightly armed. Almost laughable. The Drogon officers had time to register the contact, time to begin classifying the ships, time to wonder why their estimates of human technology were so wrong. Then the next volley arrived. 2 more Drogon cruisers died. The 5th was struck twice and broke into 3 pieces. The sixth lost an engine pod and began to spin slowly toward the planet's atmosphere, its crew screaming over open channels that no one on the human side bothered to listen to. Krass roared. The sound shook his command chamber. He grabbed Vroth by the shoulder armor and shouted that the fleet would charge. They would close the distance. They would board the human ships and tear the soft creatures apart with their claws. The crystalline armor had survived 2,000 years of war. It would survive whatever crude trick the humans were using. Vroth wanted to argue. He had seen the cruisers die. He had seen the dust clouds where ships had been. He understood, in a way Krass did not, that the rules of war had just changed forever. But Vroth was a soldier, and a soldier did not argue with a warlord. He gave the order. The remaining Drogan ships turned their bows toward the humans and began to accelerate. On the Hammerhead, Ross watched them come. He smiled for the first time that day. He told Sarah to load the heavy slugs. She already had. Down on Verdania, the war arrived with a sound like 1,000 doors slamming shut at once. Captain Henry Wells had positioned his soldiers in 3 concentric rings around the spaceport. The outer ring was cheap drones and sensor pods. The middle ring was armored vehicles dug into trenches. The inner ring was him, 200 soldiers, and every rifle the colony had ever bought. He had told his people not to fire until they could see the shape of a Drogan eye through their scopes. He had not told them why. The reason was simple. He did not want them to waste rounds on shields they could not see. The first Drogan landing craft hit the outer ring at 400 meters per second. It did not slow down because it did not expect anything to be there. The ship was a fat, ugly wedge covered in the same crystalline armor as the warships above. Its pilots had been told the humans were unarmed farmers. The craft burned through the drone field, ignored the warning sirens, and slammed into the dirt with its boarding ramps already lowering. Wells gave the order. The middle ring opened up. Rail rifles, smaller cousins of the ship-mounted weapons, fired in a slow, steady rhythm. Each rifle threw a tungsten dart the size of a finger at speeds the human eye could not follow. The Drogan personal shields, which had stopped energy weapons across half the galaxy, did absolutely nothing against pieces of metal moving faster than thought. Drogan warriors came down the ramps with their war cries already in their throats. The cries cut off mid-sound. Armor that had been forged for 2,000 years cracked open like dry bread. Bodies tumbled, twisted, and fell. The second landing craft saw what happened to the first and tried to climb. A rail dart hit its underside and the craft tilted, then dropped, then exploded across the spaceport tarmac. Wells did not watch. He was already moving his soldiers to cover a different angle, where a third craft was attempting to come down behind a hill. In the colony shelters, Director Anna Webb listened to the calm chatter and held the hand of a child whose mother had not made it inside. The child did not cry. The child was watching Anna's face, and Anna had decided long ago that her face would not show fear in front of a child. She squeezed the small hand and listened to Wells' report that the second wave was being broken before it landed. Above the planet, the situation was worse for the Drogans than it was on the ground. Warlord Krass had ordered the charge, but charging meant closing the distance, and closing the distance meant the human gunners had less work to do. Sarah Bellamy did not need long-firing solutions anymore. She needed only to point and pull. The Drogan cruisers came roaring forward, weapons firing, plasma streams spraying across the void in beautiful blue arcs. The plasma reached the human ships and splashed harmlessly across thick layers of ablative shielding. The railguns answered with metal. Ship by ship, the Drogan fleet was peeled apart. Bridges sheared off. Engine cores ruptured. Wreckage tumbled in slow, lazy spirals toward the planet's gravity well. Where Drogan warships had flown, only clouds of glittering crystalline dust remained. The dust caught the system's sun and shimmered, beautiful and terrible at the same time. Subcommander Vroth stood beside the warlord and saw the truth that Krass refused to see. The hegemony was not going to win this battle. The hegemony had already lost. Every second they remained, more Drogan warriors died for a pride that no longer made sense. Vroth had served the warlord for 30 cycles. He had never spoken against him. He spoke now. He said the fleet must withdraw. He said the humans were not what they had been told. He said the homeworld must be warned. Krass turned. His eyes were red and wide. He told Vroth that withdrawal was not a Drogan word. He told Vroth that the warriors who fell today would be remembered as heroes. He told Vroth to be silent or be dead. Vroth was silent. He did not stop thinking, but he was silent. Commander Ross, watching the Drogon fleet continue its suicidal charge, began to feel something that was not quite pity, but lived in the same neighborhood. He had expected the aliens to break and run after the first cruiser fell. They had not. He had expected them to break after the third. They had not. He understood now that the warlord on the flagship was not going to break at all. The fleet would die in pieces because one creature in red armor refused to admit that the universe had changed. So be it. He gave the order to focus fire on the flagship's escort. One ship, then another, then another. The escort melted around the flagship like ice in summer. Captain Wells, on the ground, finished clearing the second wave of landing craft and counted his losses. 17 soldiers dead, 40 wounded. The spaceport burned in a dozen places, but the perimeter held. He sat down on a piece of broken concrete and drank from a canteen that had survived the firefight by pure luck. A young soldier ran up and asked what they should do next. Wells looked at the sky, where the last of the Drogon landing craft were spinning out of control and falling like dead leaves. He told the soldier to reload. The day was not over. He was right, but it was closer to over than the Drogons believed. The flagship was alone now, and the human guns were still warm. A junior officer on the Drogon flagship vomited into his helmet. He had been on duty for 6 hours and had watched 2,000 of his kin die in less than 30 minutes. His name was Hessick, and he had joined the warrior caste because his father had told him it was the noblest path a Drogon could choose. His father had never seen a railgun. His father had never seen what crystalline armor looked like when it became dust. Hessick wiped his mouth with the back of one clawed hand and tried not to look at the tactical screen, where the human ships were still drifting closer, slow and patient, like predators that had already won and were simply choosing the order of meals. Warlord Krass did not see Hessick. Krass saw nothing but the human ships. He had moved past rage into a place that was colder and more dangerous. He had decided how this would end. If the fleet could not destroy the humans, it would deny them the satisfaction of a clean victory. He gave the order through clenched teeth. Ramming speed. Sub-Commander Vroth heard the order and felt the deck shift beneath his feet as the flagship's engines flared to maximum thrust. Around them, the 4 remaining Drogon cruisers turned their bows toward the human fleet and accelerated. The plan, if it could be called a plan, was for every Drogon ship to drive itself directly into a human vessel, trading hull for hull, life for life, dust for dust. It was a strategy that came from songs and old stories. It was not a strategy that came from thinking. On the Hammerhead, Sarah Bellamy saw the change in vector and understood immediately. She informed Commander Ross. Ross gave the order to split the fleet. 3 hunting groups, for ships each with clear lanes of fire. The Drogon ramming charge required the Drogon ships to fly in straight lines. Straight lines were the easiest possible firing solutions. Sarah almost felt bad. Almost. The first Drogon cruiser made it to within 2,000 kilometers of the human line before 3 rail slugs struck it at once. The ship simply ceased to exist as a ship. It became a slowly expanding sphere of metal fragments and crystalline dust, still moving forward at ramming speed, but no longer capable of ramming anything. The fragments swept past the human ships harmlessly, a soft rain of debris. The second cruiser made it to 1,500 kilometers. The third reached 1,000. The fourth, piloted by a young officer who had panicked and killed his own engines, drifted into human range at less than 100 meters per second and was destroyed almost gently, a single slug through the engineering deck that ended the ship without theatrics. Only the flagship remained. Krass watched his last cruisers die on the screen and laughed. It was not a sound of joy. It was the sound a creature makes when it has run out of other sounds to make. He told Vroth that they would ram alone. They would ram the lead human ship and take its commander into the next life with them. Vroth looked at the warlord. He looked at the crew, who were now looking at him. He looked at Hessick, the young officer who was still shaking near the sensor station. Vroth understood that he had a choice to make. The choice would define the rest of his life. It would also probably end it. He chose. Vroth drew his ceremonial blade, the long curved knife that every Drogon officer carried as a symbol of his oath to his warlord. He turned, and instead of using it on himself, as tradition demanded when a warlord had failed, He used it to cut the power cables to Krass's command throne. The lights on the platform died. The warlord's personal shield generator went dark. Krass roared and reached for his own weapon. Vroth did not stab him. He simply stepped between the warlord and the rest of the bridge. He told the crew that the warlord was no longer in command. He told them that he, Vroth, was assuming temporary control under the ancient law of incapacity. He told them anyone who disagreed could leave the bridge through the main doors or through him. The choice did not matter to him. No one moved toward the doors. No one moved toward Vroth. Krass screamed and lunged forward. Vroth caught him with the side of one armored arm and slammed him into the deck. The warlord hit hard. He did not get up. Two younger officers, perhaps sensing which way the wind was now blowing, dragged Krass into a side chamber and locked the door. Vroth turned to Hessek, who was staring at him with eyes the size of plates. He told the young officer to send a message to the human fleet. A simple message. The word for surrender in standard galactic code. Nothing else. No conditions. No pride. Hessek's claws shook on the console, but he sent the message. On the hammerhead, the comm officer received it and stared at the screen for a long second before turning to Commander Ross. He read the message aloud. The bridge went quiet. Ross did not smile this time. He had killed enough Drogans for one day. He had no joy left in him, only tired relief that the killing was over. He gave the order to cease fire across the fleet. Within a single breath, every railgun in the human Third Fleet went silent. The flagship drifted alone in the dust cloud of its own escorts. Its engines slowed. Its shields lowered. Sarah Bellamy unlocked her targeting station and put her face in her hands. Just for a moment. Just long enough to remember that she was a person. Then she sat up and waited for orders. Rain came to the spaceport an hour after the last shot was fired. It was a strange rain, thick and heavy, carrying with it a fine glitter that drifted down from high above. The colonists who came out of the shelters reached up and touched the falling drops. The glitter was crystalline dust. The atmosphere had pulled it down from orbit, where the broken bodies of Drogan ships had been slowly grinding themselves into smaller and smaller pieces. The dust smelled faintly of burned metal. It would coat the colony for weeks, and years later, old colonists would still find it in cracks in the pavement and remember the day the sky had wept the remains of an empire. Director Anna Webb walked through the wreckage of the spaceport with a clipboard she did not really need. The clipboard was a habit. She had carried clipboards through 3 colonial emergencies, and she had learned that holding one made people believe she had a plan. Today, she did not have much of a plan. She had a list of names. The list was the names of the people who had been at the perimeter when the Drogan landing craft came down. Some of the names had checks beside them. The checks meant the people were alive. Some did not. Captain Henry Wells walked beside her. His helmet was off, tucked under one arm, and his face was streaked with sweat and dirt and something that might have been blood from a small cut above his eyebrow. He did not seem to notice the cut. He was reading off names from his own pad as Anna worked through her list. Together, they were trying to make sure no one had been forgotten in the chaos. 23 soldiers had died. 11 civilians, mostly the ones who had not made it to the shelters in time. The numbers were small by the standards of historic battles. They felt enormous to the 2 people walking through the colony they had spent half their lives building. A young soldier, no older than 19, ran up and saluted Wells. The soldier had a question about the prisoners. Several Drogan warriors had survived their landing craft and had been disarmed and bound. They were being held in an empty hangar. The question was whether the prisoners should be fed. Wells looked at the soldier for a long moment. Then he said yes. The soldier ran off to organize it. Anna gave Wells a small look that was almost a smile. He shrugged and said that even monsters needed water. He did not really believe the Drogans were monsters anymore. He had watched them die. Monsters did not die the way these creatures had died, screaming for mothers and fathers in a language he did not understand. Whatever the Drogans were, they were not monsters. They were just soldiers, and most of them had been very young. In orbit, the human Third Fleet had moved into a wide formation around the surrendered Drogan flagship. 3 boarding craft were already on their way across the gap, carrying Marines in pressure suits, and a small diplomatic team, led by Commander Ross himself. Ross had decided to do this in person. He did not trust this moment to a video link. Inside the flagship, Sub-Commander Vroth waited at the main airlock with his hands open and visible. He had ordered every Drogon on the bridge to do the same. The crystalline armor that they had all worn into battle had been removed and stacked in piles in the corridor. It was, Vroth had decided, no longer something to be proud of. It was a relic. It was the symbol of the lie that had cost his people everything today. The airlock cycled. Ross stepped through with 4 Marines behind him. He was a tall, tired man in a plain gray uniform. He carried no weapon. He looked Vroth in the eyes, which was difficult because Drogon eyes were set far apart and humans were not really designed to make eye contact with such creatures. He managed it anyway. He spoke through a translator unit. He told Vroth that he accepted the surrender. He told Vroth that the surviving Drogon crew would be treated according to the old laws of war, which the human fleet still kept even when their enemies did not. He told Vroth that the warlord, Crass, would be held separately and turned over to whatever authority the Drogon hegemony chose to send. Vroth lowered his head. He said something through the translator that did not quite come out right at first. The translator tried again. The word was thank. Vroth had said thank you. It was perhaps the first time in 1,000 years a Drogon officer had said those words to a member of another species. Ross nodded. He did not know what to say back. He had expected anger or pride or some kind of warrior speech. He had not expected gratitude. He found that gratitude was harder to receive than hate. Behind him, the Marines began the slow work of escorting the Drogon crew off the ship. They were not rough. There was no need to be. The fight was gone from the prisoners. Many of them simply walked with their eyes on the floor, processing the fact that they were still alive when they had been certain they would not be. Hessek, the young censor officer, was the last to leave the bridge. He paused at the door and looked back at the empty command platform where Crass had stood. The lights were still off there. He turned away and followed the others. In a side chamber, locked behind a heavy door, Warlord Crass sat alone in the dark. He did not speak. He did not move. He had finally understood, and the understanding had taken something out of him that would never come back. Above the planet, the dust kept falling. 6 weeks after the battle, an old gardener named Tobin was the first colonist to plant a tree in the rebuilt central plaza of Verdania. The tree was a young oak, no taller than his shoulder, brought from a greenhouse on the outskirts of the colony where the war had not reached. Tobin dug the hole himself, even though half a dozen volunteers had offered to help. He said it was important that someone old did this. He said young hands had spent enough time digging graves lately, and a tree was the opposite of a grave. Director Anna Webb stood nearby with her arms folded and did not interrupt him. Captain Wells stood beside her, also silent. The plaza around them was full of new construction, scaffolding, and the smell of fresh paint. The tree, when it was finally settled into the ground, looked impossibly small against all of it. But it was a beginning, and beginnings were what the colony needed. The news of the battle had moved across the galaxy faster than anyone expected. It had moved faster than light, in some ways, because gossip among ambassadors and spies traveled by quick courier ships and by whispered messages that did not need formal channels. Within a month of Verdania, 3 different empires that had been quietly preparing to test humanity decided to test something else instead. A fleet that had been gathering near the edge of human space turned around without explanation and went home. A trade delegation that had been planning to make impossible demands suddenly became very polite. A pirate clan that had specialized in raiding human freighters announced that they were retiring to take up farming. The galaxy had received a lesson, and the galaxy had paid attention. The Drogon hegemony was the slowest to recover. The loss of Warlord Crass and an entire invasion fleet had created a power vacuum on the homeworld that took months to settle. When the dust finally cleared, both literally and politically, the new ruling council sent an unusual choice to be the Drogon ambassador to Earth. They sent Subcommander Vroth, who had been quietly released after his cooperation with the human authorities. Vroth arrived on Earth in a simple black uniform with no crystalline armor anywhere on his body. He gave a short speech in front of the human assembly. The speech was about humility, about the dangers of believing in a single advantage for too long, and about the possibility that 2 species who had begun as enemies might, with patience, become something else. Some humans cried during the speech. Vroth, who had spent his whole life being told that tears were weakness, found that he was not embarrassed by them. Commander Daniel Ross was promoted to admiral, but he refused every interview, every documentary, every offer to write a book. He had decided that the story of Verdania was not his to tell. He spent most of his time after the promotion at a small house on the coast of Maine, where he watched the ocean and did not talk much about the past. When journalists tracked him down, he told them politely to leave. He kept a single photograph on his desk. It was a picture of his Third Fleet, taken before the battle, with all 12 ships and all of their crews. Some of the people in the picture had not survived. He looked at the picture every morning. He never explained to anyone why. Lieutenant Sarah Bellamy was assigned to a new post at the Human Naval Academy, where she trained the next generation of railgun officers. She turned out to be a surprisingly patient teacher. The cadets called her ma'am at first, then later, after they got to know her, they called her by a quieter nickname that had to do with mathematics and precision and the way she always seemed to know exactly where a target would be a few seconds before it arrived there. She stayed in touch with Commander Ross for the rest of his life. They wrote letters. Real paper letters, sent through real mail. Neither of them quite trusted electronic messages anymore, having seen what humans could do with metal and precision when they decided to try. Captain Henry Wells stayed on Verdania. He retired from the militia within a year of the battle and opened a small school for young colonists, where he taught history and basic engineering. The school did not have a fancy name. It was just called the Wells School, and it was attended by children who knew, even if they did not fully understand, that the man teaching them had once held a perimeter against an alien empire with 200 soldiers and a lot of stubbornness. He never spoke in class about the day the Drogans came. The children sometimes asked. He always changed the subject. Director Anna Webb served 2 more terms as the leader of Verdania, then retired to a cottage near the new oak tree in the central plaza. The tree had grown taller than her by then. She liked to sit beneath it in the afternoons and watch the colony move around her. New buildings, new families, new ships in the sky that did not threaten anyone, because by then no one threatened humanity anymore. Far above the planet, in the cold and patient dark, the crystalline dust of the Drogan fleet still drifted. Some of it had fallen to the surface in the rains. Some of it had been pulled into the sun. Most of it remained in long, slow orbits, glittering when the system star caught it at the right angle. From a distance, it looked almost beautiful. From a closer distance, it was a permanent reminder of what happens when an old empire underestimates a young species that simply refuses to be conquered. Humanity had not just survived the Battle of Verdania. Humanity had rewritten the rules of the galaxy, and the dust kept on shining.